Hello and welcome to Viva. You may have noticed that my studio has taken a step backwards because I moved out of my office and into a closet. And so I began to paint this Christogram behind me for a little bit of decoration. I'm going to do some other things, hopefully someday when I have some time. But sorry if things don't look as good as they used to look. Tonight, I want to discuss the concept of magnanimity and especially in how it relates to charity and solutions to some of the problems of charity. Right. I'm going to begin, as I often begin, by talking about Saint Ignatius Loyola. Fantastic saint, a real doctor of the spirit. He 500 years ago was involved in an accident. Okay, so he grows up wanting to be someone distinguished in his ability to fight and his ability to operate in the sort of court system of Spain. And there's a battle going on in Pamplona. And so St. Ignatius rides his horse, 100 miles an hour into the fray, right into it to go and distinguish himself in battle. And just as the Spaniards who were fighting the French at the time were just about ready to give up, St. Ignatius shows up, gets everybody excited, gets everybody to want to go back to fighting again. And not long after that, they begin to fight. They were about ready to give up. They begin to fight, and then St. Ignatius is hit by a cannonball. The cannonball sort of bounces off the ground, passes between his two knees, and really damages one of them and just obliterates the other one. And so a lot of people believe that this cannonball moment is the moment when St. Ignatius's plans had to change. He went from wanting to be a big somebody distinguished in the world to suddenly wanting to be a big somebody distinguished in God's eyes. I would like to maybe change some of that concept. First of all, I think St. Ignatius, just as soon as he was injured, thought that, hey, I still have big dreams. I still have big dreams of wanting to be distinguished in this world, for really being a somebody special here in this world. But that injury gave him time to think about bigger, more important things. So it wasn't because he lost his ability to be something special, but rather he had the time to stop and think about it, the time to pray. And in that time of convalescence, he sort of began to discern the spirits, in a sense, try to figure out what things were calling him in what direction. And ultimately, he had a conversion of heart over a long period of time. So he was predisposed to vainglory. That was a major sin that he had, and he admits it quite often in his autobiography. Vainglory, right? He had this sense that he was a big somebody, and he needed to be a big somebody in this world, and he was ready to put all of his efforts into succeeding in this world. So as he fought against those things, that's where I think you see a lot of the fruit of his prayer, a lot of the fruit of his spiritual life becomes so applicable to us, because I think we all suffer from some of those very same vices that St. Ignatius suffered from. Let's go through a quick sort of philosophical history of magnanimity, right? This virtue of magnanimity. First, let's look at what Aristotle had to say about magnanimity. He saw magnanimity as like one of two peaks of the virtues, right? So in other words, they're sort of like a peak of a virtue. Think of the peak of a mountain up at the top. It's above all of the rest of the mountain, but it's supported by the rest of the mountain. So in other words, it kind of like it includes all of the bottom of the mountain. The peak does. So magnanimity and justice were these two peaks of virtue. And so they aren't the same. They have a little bit of conflict between them. So you can't say that they're really one and the same peak, according to Aristotle and according to Aristotle's view of virtues. So what can we say about the magnanimous person? Well, in his Nicomachean Ethics, Aristotle says that the magnanimous person thinks he deserves praise, and he does deserve praise, right? So he believes he deserves praise. He knows he's a big deal, and he is a big deal. That is a magnanimous person. He's kind of a big deal, and he deserves to be a big deal. He's also a little bit unsatisfied with praise. In other words, he craves praise, but he's also going to be unimpressed with others. He's also going to be unimpressed with what other people offer him in the way of praise. It's never quite enough. Um, he hates the idea. A magnanimous person, according to Aristotle, hates the idea of owing anyone anything. He wants to be the one that people owe things to. He wants to be the one who gets the credit for the good things in this world. He's big souled. Magnanimous means great souled, big souled. He's got this big spirit. He's a big somebody. And so therefore he needs to be able to take credit for those good things that are out there if he's truly magnanimous. Real quick, here's a quote from Aristotle. Magnanimity, then, seems to be a certain kind of adornment of the virtues, since it makes them greater and does not come about without them, right? Think of the peak of that mountain. For this reason, it is difficult to be truly magnanimous, for it is not possible without the beauty that belongs to goodness. In other words, if it's hard to be good, it's going to be hard to be magnanimous. If it takes a whole lot of talent, a whole lot of skill, a whole lot of something to be good, then it's going to take that to be magnanimous. So you're going to have this conflict then with the virtue of justice. Justice, at its heart, people getting what they deserve. So justice, whether that's criminal justice, a criminal gets what he deserves, or something like social justice, where the system is kind of set up in such a way that the dignity of the human person is preserved by these systems. That they're going to make sure that everybody gets what they deserve in that sense. But justice definitely is an awareness of what people are owed, of what people deserve. So magnanimity, you believe that you're the one that deserves all the praise. You believe that you're the one that deserves the credit. So it's really difficult to take the magnanimous person in Aristotle's sense of the word magnanimous. It's really hard to take the magnanimous person and the person who's very concerned with justice and see how these two things fit. Early Christians understood this problem. Let's say the early Christians understood this problem with this sort of Greek version of being magnanimous, because early Christians were very into the concepts of humility, right? So for them, it's all about being humble, all about being weak. The Hebrew word is anawim, and there's this sense of being meek and humble. That they are blessed in God's eyes, right? That God uplifts the poor. So you don't want to be this person who's not poor in spirit. You want to be poor in spirit. You are blessed if you are poor in spirit. If you instead are such a big deal and everybody knows it, that's not what Jesus is talking about in the Beatitudes, right? So early Christians saw right away that there was this problem. Humility was this chief good, right? Humility, this sense of being humbled or bowed down with your head bowed down in the presence of God. To put it another way, is to know that you are a sinner, right? To know that you are a sinner. This is a big virtue for those early Christians, and they were fighting the concept that they were exposed to from the Greek side of things. So when you have, Christianity eventually takes this concept of humility and puts it together with the concept of charity, right? That we should all be humble and charitable, right? That we should all be humble and charitable. So you see very early on then this monastic movement where people are saying, okay, in the world, I am vain. In the world, vainglory is getting to me. So I have to go out to the desert where I can be humbled, and I can go out to the desert, and that's going to be my act of charity. My act of charity in the world is to go out and to try to be holy apart from the world. And in that holiness, I'm being charitable for everybody else. I'm praying for the world. I'm sanctifying the world with my own holiness, right? These early desert fathers were big into this. Think about eventually how those monks who went out into the desert began to come together in these monasteries. So originally it was kind of these almost kind of hermits, right? These hermetical, this hermetic type of living, that they start coming together in monasteries. And in the monastery, according to Saint Benedict, for example, then all of a sudden humility takes on this other dimension of first being about obedience, right? So humility is not just running away from vainglory in the world, but running towards a world in which the presence of another human being telling me what to do is going to save my soul. So unlike what I think most people think about monks, they think they're so holy they have to go live in a monastery. Not so. They're so unholy they have to go live in a monastery, right? The monastery is there to save their souls. Okay. So eventually you get to someone like St. Thomas Aquinas, who in his Secunda Secundae, question 129 in the Summa, he's going to address magnanimity head on. And here's what he's got to say about all that. Well, first of all, he's going to say as a virtue, he's going to say it's going to fall between two things, right? Virtues typically are things that, for this infused grace inside of you, it's going to be between two things. And magnanimity is going to be between vainglory, right? So if you go too far, magnanimity becomes vainglory. And if you if you don't go far enough, you have this sort of pusillanimous. So magnanimity means big soul, and pusillanimous is little soul, right? So you are too small. Like you're just sitting there saying, "Oh, little old me, I could never do all that." That's a pusillanimous person right there, who can't imagine that they have anything to offer. And in fact, it's a misuse of God's gifts. God's given you so many gifts, and instead you say, well, not me. I'm so humble. I could never do those things. That's not really true humility. So here's the objection, right? Here's the objection that Thomas Aquinas is going to answer. The first objection, or the objection number 4. He says, the objection says, no virtue is opposed to another virtue. So no real virtue is opposed to another virtue. But magnanimity is opposed to humility, since the magnanimous deems himself worthy of great things and despises others. Okay, so that's therefore magnanimity is not a virtue. All right, well, here is Thomas Aquinas' answer to that. There is in man something great which he possesses through the gift of God, and something defective which accrues to him through the weakness of nature. I have to go on a small tangent real quick. Often when Thomas Aquinas talks about nature, he's talking about our fallen human nature. And it's like you have nature and grace, and that often what he's focusing on about our nature is that part that's broken. When you hear St. Ignatius talk, he's usually saying, when he mentions nature, it's that part of us that God created for something big, for something good, right? So he calls the devil, for example, the enemy of our human nature, the enemy of our nature. So nature is something, according to St. Ignatius, which is going to be this good thing that God has made us for, and then it gets messed up. Whereas Thomas Aquinas speaks about it often saying, like, it's our fallen nature that's holding us back. These don't actually conflict, even though I think these two great saints are using the word in different ways. Okay, back to Thomas Aquinas. There is in man something great which he possesses through the gift of God, and something defective which accrues to him through the weakness of nature. Accordingly, magnanimity makes a man deem himself worthy of great things in consideration of the gifts he holds from God. Thus, if his soul is endowed with great virtue, magnanimity makes him tend to perfect works of virtue. And the same is to be said of the use of any other good, such as science or external fortune. In other words, these abilities that we have, right? They're going to work towards virtue if we're doing it right. The same can be said the use of any other good, such as science or external fortune. On the other hand, humility makes a man think little of himself in consideration of his own deficiency, and magnanimity makes him despise others insofar as they fall away from God's gifts, since he does not think so much of others as to do anything wrong for their sake. Yet humility makes us honor others and esteem them better than ourselves, insofar as we see some of God's gifts in them. Okay, so you have gifts. You recognize gifts in other people. You want to see the world a better place. And these gifts, a real honest assessment is to say, God has blessed me. God has blessed me. And therefore, I've got to go out and use these gifts, right? So therefore, magnanimity is a virtue, right? It's a kind of a fortitude, according to Thomas Aquinas, right? So fortitude, think about fortitude as a strength, an ability to overcome obstacles. So magnanimity is a kind of fortitude. It's this ability to overcome obstacles, these things that get in the way of you doing what you're supposed to be doing. So Thomas Aquinas, he fixes Aristotle by relating man to God through knowledge of God and through love of God, right? So it's because God has given you these gifts that they become tools in your hand, like other gifts, like science, like anything else, like any kind of other ability or talent, that they become tools in your hand. And it's because God is in the picture that magnanimity can be a real virtue. Whereas for Aristotle, it was a virtue, but it had trouble meshing with justice, right? Justice. Okay, so if justice is recognizing what everybody deserves, then that's like saying I recognize that on my own, I'm not doing all these things on my own. Someone taught me the things that I know. Someone contributed to me having the things that I have. So, my parents raised me. There's all this wisdom. I'm standing on the shoulders of giants, all that kind of stuff. So justice means I recognize the good works that other people have done. They deserve the praise that they get in justice. And I don't deserve all the praise that there is in justice. And so because I don't deserve all the praise, justice and humility start looking like the same thing, right? So justice and humility start becoming the same kind of concept. People deserve deserve more than I would give them if I was completely full of myself. If vainglory was my great big vice, right? Okay. So then in comes Saint Ignatius, right? Saint Ignatius very clearly links, not unlike Thomas Aquinas, but maybe more explicitly, links everything in terms of gratitude to God. So I recognize the talents that I have. I recognize that, hey, there are some things some ways in which I am a big deal, right? Some ways in which I do have some talents that God gave me. Some ways in which God has made some things for me kind of easy. And so in response to that, I'm going to take it and use it for the way that God would want me to do that, right? Now, he says, don't get that confused, or don't let humility in some kind of way hold you back. People sometimes wonder, how is it that the Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, how is it that the Jesuits can have so many like successful institutions over the 500-year period that the Jesuits have been around? It's unbelievable, some of the things that they've built and done and accomplished. And people can sometimes say, how in the world do they get those things done? It's because they recognize that all of the things God gave us need to be directed to God's greater glory, right? So I need to go from good to better with those things that God has given me. And it doesn't do me any good to take a false sense of humility and let that hold me back. A false sense of humility that says, I want people to think that I'm humble, so I'm not going to stand up and offer my services whenever they're needed. Think about how rotten that is. Think about how terrible, how much you would be depriving the world of all the gifts that God has given you so that you can appear humble. I think St. Ignatius knows that false humility is a pretty big temptation for a whole lot of people. And so he says, don't worry about that as much as worry about, being really and truly magnanimous, right? And so humility is truly, the real humility is thankfulness, right? And in that sense, any real sin is probably coming from a place of ingratitude. Any real sin is probably coming from a place of ingratitude. I think about the spiritual exercises, these drills that St. Ignatius wants you to drill into your head through prayer, these different ways of looking at the world and praying to God. And one of them is one of the earliest ones is to imagine that the Trinity is looking down on the world and seeing on the world all these things that are going on, and knowing that we on our end deserve to be condemned for the smallest sin. And so in gratitude for the fact that we are not yet condemned, in gratitude that we have however much life God wants to let us have for the rest of our lives here, in gratitude for not being condemned yet, we ought to just turn it on for God. We ought to just give God all that we have and turn around and use all of our abilities. St. Ignatius is known for saying love ought to express itself in deeds more so than in words. Your love for God, your gratitude for him not condemning you, turns into deeds, right? Expresses itself in deeds. Saint Ignatius is also, famous for more or less. He didn't say this exactly this way, but the way it gets said is kind of as like an aphorism. Pray as if everything depends on God. Work as if everything depends on you. Pray as if everything depends on God. So when you pray to God, say, God, I know that I can't do anything without your help. Dear God, I know that I need you for everything that I possibly could call good in my life. Dear God, I know that I will not be able to accomplish anything in the future without your help, your providence, all those things. That's what your prayer ought to look like. And you ought to believe it. Like your prayer ought not just to be some empty words. You ought to be believing those things. But then when you turn around to try to accomplish the things that you know you should be trying to accomplish, work as if everything depends on you. Work as if God is not going to snap his fingers and make it happen. Work as if you're the one who's got to make it happen without any help from anybody else, right? Now, your internal attitude you ought to be completely thankful, but your external work ethic ought to be like, hey, guess what? This all depends on you. Okay, that doesn't mean that you don't pray. Obviously, if you're praying, you're praying, you're doing all those things. But the work that you put into it, you're putting your back into it. God gave you a strong back, put your back into it. Okay, so charity then, and this is why I think this is so important to talk about this magnanimity, is because we often find ourselves, because we know that charity is the chief virtue. We often find ourselves focusing on charity as if every answer is found within a study of the virtue of charity. And I think that if you study charity correctly, you will find every answer that, the answer to everything is love. The answer to everything is love. But sometimes it helps to sort of like come around from a different direction and look at these things from a different direction. We often have some kind of basic questions like, how far should I go in correcting someone who's done something wrong? In charity, I'm going to correct them, but I'm going to feel like a mean person if I do that, right? If we start with magnanimity instead, or if we start with if we develop, I should say, if we develop that virtue of magnanimity, then sometimes it makes us ask the question differently about whether or not we should correct someone for something they've done wrong, instead of being I don't know, thin skinned, right? Or so worried that somebody's going to, you know, uh, um, make me look bad, or something like that, or somebody is, not on my team, or all these different sort of temptations. If our first thing is like, okay, what's the charitable thing to do here? We ought to instead maybe look at magnanimity as a means to being somewhat indifferent, right? So somewhat willing, for example, willing and able to suffer uh, to suffer insults, right? And as we suffer insults, we become unified with Christ insulted, right? We find a certain kind of unity with Christ who was misunderstood. We can find a unity with Christ who was not looked up to in all the ways that he should have been looked up to during his earthly ministry. And so, that magnanimity, properly understood, can help us be really and truly indifferent, except insofar as it's for God's greater glory. So this means sometimes we're going to have to correct the record, right? So sometimes we have to set the record straight for some things. It's important to do that. And we would never hope that somebody else sins by talking poorly about us or anything like that. We never hope that somebody else sins just so we can somehow suffer under their sin. But sometimes it just happens, right? Sometimes people don't get us. Sometimes people say bad things about us. Sometimes people don't understand us. And sometimes we don't even understand ourselves. Like sometimes we need something said bad about us every now and then. I'm not perfect. I need to be corrected. I need to be, somebody needs to insult me every now and then, right? I think I need it. I think it's good. It's good for that to happen. So St. Ignatius built this into the constitutions of the Jesuits, right? Let me quickly read to you from the constitutions. By the way, a lot of what I'm saying today is coming from a little book by Will. He's actually a transitional deacon right now, Deacon William McCormick. He'll be a priest by June, but he's a friend of mine. He doesn't know that I'm stealing a lot of his research, but he wrote the studies in Jesuit studies in the spirituality of Jesuits. He wrote a little something in there, and anyway, he quotes from the constitutions. I'm going to quote from him. Magnanimity and fortitude of soul are likewise highly necessary for him, so that he may bear the weaknesses of many, initiate great undertakings in the service of God our Lord, and persevere in them with the needed constancy, neither losing courage in the face of contradictions, even from persons of high rank and power, nor allowing himself to be deflected by their entreaties or threats from what reason and the divine service require. He should be superior to all eventualities, not letting himself be exalted by success or cast down by adversity, and being quite ready to accept death when necessary for the good of the society, capital S, Society of Jesus, the Jesuits, for the good of the Jesuits in the service of Jesus Christ, our God and Lord. This is in the constitutions of the Jesuits, right? So obviously nobody is bound to that except for the Jesuits, right? But I do think it's interesting that St. Ignatius wants the Jesuits themselves to be ready to be martyred, which is going to take a certain kind of magnanimity. It's a way in which, what does he say here? He says, you have to be above all those things. How are you above all of those eventualities? You're above them because you don't let them change how you are. And sometimes when we talk about, is something charitable? Is a statement charitable? Is it not? I think charity ought to be, we ought to remember that it's a virtue. It's an internal disposition. And so magnanimity, if we work on magnanimity, the charity part is just easier, I think, to manage. I think it's easier it's better soil for charity to take root, right? If you are magnanimous, if you are ready to be above all those other things, where you are not so easily challenged by adversity or propped up and get a big head from success or anything like that. Here's another place where I think you see the same kind of attitude. This is what's called the presupposition in the spiritual exercises of St. Ignatius. So think about this. The spiritual exercises are like a set of guidelines for spiritual directors or retreat directors for how to deal with people who are on retreat. And this is what it says. This is before he gets in any exercises at all. He says, to assure better cooperation between the one who is giving the exercises and the exercitant, the person who's making the exercises, or the retreatant, and more beneficial results for both, it is necessary to suppose that every good Christian is more ready to put a good interpretation on another's statement than to condemn it as false. If an orthodox construction cannot be put on a proposition, the one who made it should be asked how he understands it. If he is in error, he should be corrected with all kindness. If this does not suffice, all appropriate means should be used to bring him to a correct interpretation and so defend the proposition from error. So it's like the last thing is the correction. The first part is this receptivity, okay? Is this sense that maybe there's something I should be receiving in all of this. Maybe there's a point there that I should be hearing and understanding. Maybe there's something I don't know, right? Maybe that's where I think the real humility comes in. There's lots out there that God is going to want to teach me, and he's going to want to teach me through my neighbor. So there's lots here that I don't know and I need to be taught. So there's this receptivity there. And then if I'm not sure how they mean it, in other words, I can't put a good interpretation on it. So I try to put a good interpretation, no matter how unlikely it may be that this other person is trying to say something good and holy. I try to understand it in a good and holy way. And if I can't, then I might go to them and in all kindness ask them, how did you mean that? And then, and so, okay, obviously there's people that make big statements out there on the internet, and some of those statements are just flat out wrong. They're just absolutely doctrinally wrong, and they need to be corrected. Okay. But there ought to be this internal attitude that is not immediately personally challenged by every little thing that contradicts something that I've said in the past or something like that, right? St. Ignatius in his discernment of spirits, rules for the discernment of spirits, often talks about how the evil spirit, for someone who is doing well, right? For someone who wants to serve God, for someone who is doing well and in the service of God and desiring to serve God, the evil spirit sometimes sneaks in as an angel of light, right? And starts off even by offering you consolations. Look at how good you're doing. Look at how many souls you're saving. Look at how correct your doctrine is. Look at how, the way that you're helping other people get everything straight in the world. Look at how you are, doing all the good things that you're supposed to be doing. And then the evil spirit sneaks in and and finds a way to twist all of that and make it more about you and make it more about something other than about serving God, something other than about serving your neighbor, something other than using all the skills that God has given you, all the intellect, all the strength, all the different things, all the different gifts that God has given you, and somehow is going to use it so that you can tear down other people, so that you can just break them down and insult them, right? Go after them with insults, and and you can always tell, because often whenever insults are what you're leading with, and insults are the meat of what you're trying to say, and insults are the way that you end it, usually people who that's their whole game, when that's everything they're doing, that's often a pretty good sign that that person is insecure. That person is not magnanimous. That person is insecure. And other people can see it from the outside usually faster than you can see it yourself. So we got to be careful. We got to be very, very careful when it comes to that sort of thing. I want to close real quick with a story from the life of Saint Ignatius. Um, he had this big dream that he and these Jesuits were going to go to Jerusalem and sort of start a spiritual crusade. Right, he was going to convert all the Saracens that were there, and all the all these the people that were in Jerusalem, and make them all Catholic again. Right, make Jerusalem Catholic again. And the Franciscans that were there already didn't like that, and they said he couldn't come because he was gonna disturb a very precarious peace that they had there, and they said he couldn't come. In fact, they told him they were going to excommunicate him if he didn't leave Jerusalem, because he did go as a pilgrim to Jerusalem. And so when he left, he had these big dreams of going back. He was going to start the Jesuits and bring all these Jesuits with him. They were going to go and convert Jerusalem. And so he's on the road to a place called La Storta, and he has this vision where he sees Christ carrying the cross, and God and the Holy Spirit. He says to God the Father, he says, place me with your son. Place me with your son. I don't want to be anywhere else. Whatever else, however you want me to do it, whatever you call me to, whatever big thing you might be calling me to, place me with your son. And the answer he gets back is that I will be good to you in Rome, which for a pusillanimous person or vainglorious person, this would be crushing news. This would be crushing news. You want to go to Jerusalem and conquer Jerusalem, and instead you're told go to Rome, which is already Catholic, right? Which is already, you could argue, kind of corrupt, with the clergy at the time and all that sort of stuff. You could make a lot of arguments for why, like, that's the last place anybody with a sense of adventure, anybody with a sense of, I'm going to be this knight in the service of my king, God, and all the sort of stuff, that all of a sudden you have to go to Rome, where you're basically going to be behind a desk. So St. Ignatius, to found the Jesuits, ended up being behind a desk in Rome to found, I think, the greatest order ever, and sending out some of the greatest missionaries the world has ever known, right? Starting with Francis Xavier, to the North American martyrs, to these guys out in China, to, this is a fantastic, to all South America. This is, one of the greatest missionary orders the world has ever known. And St. Ignatius had to be the one behind the desk writing letters, telling people how it should be done, right? This had to be very hard for him. So the Jesuits to this day, some of the Jesuits, right? So the fully professed Jesuits, those Jesuits who take all the vows, take one particular vow that I think encapsulates what I'm trying to say. The Jesuit would make this vow: so poverty, chastity, and obedience, but then make this vow upon final vows, right? Upon lots and lots of testing and training and all this kind of stuff. Could be 15, could be 20 years later, maybe more, after entering the novitiate. He gets to take this vow: to go without subterfuge or excuse, as far as in us lies, to whatsoever provinces they may choose to send us, whether they are pleased to send us among the Turks or any other infidels, even those who live in the region called the Indies, or among any heretics whatever. This sense of, like, send me wherever my skills are, send me to a place where I can put them to the service of God. That is magnanimity. If you had to take a vow of magnanimity, that's that vow of magnanimity. because God knows if you're going to find yourself in some of these places, you may never, no one there may even know your name, right? That you may end up in an unmarked grave somewhere. You may end up a martyr. You may end up never remembered for anything. You may wind up speaking a language that you didn't grow up speaking, in a culture you didn't grow up operating in. And yet that is what a magnanimous person is able to do. And all of a sudden, your ability to exercise that virtue of charity becomes much more clear and obvious. Anyway, I hope thinking about that is helpful to some people out there. I certainly wasn't talking about anybody in particular or anything like that. I wasn't, certainly not criticizing anybody or anything like that, except for maybe myself. Usually, whenever I'm talking about these things, I'm talking about them because I know myself. I suffer from these very same things. So I'm going to look in the chat over here and see if there's anything that I could address here. I see Catholic Crusader Deus Volt says he's listening while he's driving. Good to be with you. God bless you, Abel. Deus Volt. I see Hallelujah. Thank you, Haley, for being in the chat and making sure nobody's saying terrible things there. Haley says, "You painted that behind you. That's great." I sure did, and I'm not finished. I have a lot of highlights to put on the. I want to make it look really nice, and I haven't done that yet. I just enough on the wall so far to keep it from being just a blank wall. Let's see here. City of the Immaculata. I've been watching your videos. Those are very good. Thank you so much for all that you're putting on the internet. Tom, always a good man to see around. Let's see here. Did you say La Porta was the town of his vision? It was the road to La Storta. All right. Thanks, Father. God bless you. God bless you, Teresa H. Okay. Thank you, everybody, for tuning in. I appreciate your views, and hopefully I'll get to making videos a little bit more frequently. God bless. Bye-bye.